Hi, everybody. This is Conversations and Translations, and you listening to me, Franklin Esau. Conversations and Translations is where the conversation is real and the dive is deep. And today on our show, we'll be speaking about a very sensitive yet such an important topic that really helps us as men and as women to discover more about ourselves, and that is sex and sexuality. And we have a very special person to speak about it, who wrote a perfect and such an amazing book about the topic and the subject. Please, everybody, welcome Paul Abramowitz. Hi, Paul. How are you doing?
Hey, Franklin. I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on your program. I look forward to diving deep with you. How are you doing?
Thanks, man. I'm fine. I can't complain. Before we start, you have written a book called Sex, and it's for men, and it is for the women who love them. So this is such an amazing book, and this is really the book that kickstarts off the topic for today. But before we start, who is Paul?
Well, Franklin, I'm definitely a very curious human being. From a very young age, I've been interested in noticing the experiences around me. And although I didn't have the words to describe that kind of curiosity, I think I always sought out curious people. I became passionate about mastering the guitar, songwriting, painting and sculpting at about the age of 6. And then a little bit later on in my life, I developed an interest in the sciences, biology, physiology, anatomy. And actually, that reminds me of a wonderful quote by a cognitive neuroscientist, Neil Seth, who said that we experience the world and ourselves with, through, and because of our living bodies. So from quite an early age, I think this point of view would have resonated with me really, really well. The relationship that we have as human beings with our bodies, as Neil Seth alludes to, and what sense it allows us to make of our reality really has been a constant and curious source of attraction for me. So professionally, I've also been very lucky to have been part of the medical and surgical healing arts for the last 35 years as a specialist in the field of dental medicine. And the field has allowed me to really move into close spaces with biology. In other words, to partner with the intelligence of our body's biology by way of healing and reconstruction modalities. And of course, the privilege of building fantastic relationships with patients over the last 35 years has really been and remains very meaningful for me. But let me stay on track with your question, Franklin, as it relates to the book. Since adolescence, I have been fascinated by how we men are so intensely focused on sex, to the point that it impacts our thoughts, our decisions, and manages to constantly distract us. And more often than not, succeeds in impacting our relationships and our personal potential and our striving for self-mastery. And I think that this phenomenon of being so intensely focused on sex for men seems to have been true and present throughout history, and to a degree throughout all cultures as well. I think from the time of Socrates, men have been contemplating this great predicament. And there's a great British author, Kingsley Amis, when he woke up to his 50-year relationship with his active libido, he said it was like being chained to a madman. So together with this curiosity about the intensity of our sex drive and its impact on our consciousness, I was also fascinated by how differently we men seem to interpret and experience sex and sexuality compared to women. And later, as I became involved in personal development work and self-mastery group and facilitation work, I also began to notice how our development and individuation is so impacted by our being sexual by nature. Now, in relation to my trajectory to coming to write a book like this. I think I grew up in a home that was largely quite medically orientated, and pertaining to this particular life's work of mine and the topic of the book, my late father influenced very much this trajectory of mine. He was a gynecologist and an obstetrician. He was also a sex therapist, and he introduced me to the notion of sex therapy in the first place, as well as many teachings around reproduction and pregnancy, and in fact, sex with awareness. And at about the age of 11, I discovered all of his books in our study in the house. And eventually I realized what I was reading. Besides the journals and the academic textbooks, there were magazines that contained very tender letters from single people and from couples who were struggling with their relationship as it pertained especially to sex and intimacy. So very early on, I was exposed to the collective pain and the joy of sex, at least theoretically. And slowly and very surely, as I read more into the material and I came into my own puberty, I began to develop a rather fortunate and amazing and open curiosity and respect for the gravitas of sex and its vibrant intersection of so many things like pleasure and intimacy and consciousness, and of course, human potential and the overarching aspect of biology. And I also became deeply moved by the sacred and potentially transformational nature of sex. Many, many years later, after completing my postdoctoral studies at dental school, I studied more about sex and intimacy and human sexuality and sexology through a broad range of therapeutic modalities, Eastern and Western. And then some years ago, I began to work in the therapeutic field, in the therapeutic space with clients. So coupled with this growth through my home environment, I also had a constant philosophy which was ever present, and one particular inquiry that continues to fascinate me, which is really, and I think you work a lot in this realm as well, Franklin, how we make sense of things and how our so-called frame of reference, which begins at childhood, helps us to construct our very own personal sense of reality and subsequently to our beliefs and the style of relationships we choose, and how these older patterns and habits will determine the quality of our lives unless these are reevaluated. This personal trajectory lives very large when it comes to sex and the meaning we give it in our lives as men and certainly as adult men. And I know that that's a thread of frame of reference that you're, as I said, you're extremely well versed in, and you coach people through.
I was wondering, why did you write a book? Because I didn't know why you were busy writing a book a couple of years ago when we met. Yeah. And really there was just this heaviness revolving around my relationship, where me and my wife, we have gone through many challenges. And in those challenges, we usually find ourselves not in the domain or not in the atmosphere of sexual or of sex or of romance, and the passion kind of quiets down, and this usually means an absence of sex. And as I've moved out and into the world and experienced a lot of things, you find those atmosphere to be more joyful and more happier than your own house even sometimes. And when we spoke, you have just not opened my eyes to sex being it. In actual fact, you've actually added some value into me understanding my sexuality revolving around this. So why did Paul decide to write a book about sex and sexuality?
So, sure, I think that's a beautiful question, and I love the way that you led into that question, Franklin. I want to say a very brief word about what you mentioned moving into this question, and that is that the power of our sex life and the happiness that we have in our sex life is way underplayed, I think, with regards to how it impacts couples interacting with each other. So I'll leave that there. I know that we'll come back to that in a moment, but why a book around sex and sexuality does touch into that as well is because I wanted to introduce a conversation that was a little bit more serious, that paid attention to what I felt was missing in the landscape of conversation, particularly for the heterosexual male, which I'll talk about in a moment. But to answer your question, I think there are a lot of bits and pieces to do justice to your question. So I'll try and touch on the bits and pieces that come to mind. Please jump in if I meander away from your topic and stop me and say, hey, come back. Where have you gone? So why a book around sex and sexuality? Because, Franklin, if we as men are looking to develop a great mastery in our lives, including great relational mastery, health and fitness, then we will be much better served when we open ourselves to an inquiry around sex, because, here's the drum roll, sex bleeds into all the ways that we try and make sense of ourselves and the world as men. I'll say that again. Sex bleeds into all the way that we try and make sense of ourselves and the world as men. I would say that for us as men, from puberty, we are thoroughly seduced towards accepting and becoming early adopters of a very condensed and abridged version of ourselves. That means that how we first meet the sex urge and how we respond and manage it informs greatly who we then become as adult men. So by creating a practical resource, a book about sex and sexuality, that allows for us to change our relationship to this original junior sex mind, sex body paradigm, we can begin to live into a much more expanded version of ourselves with sex and intimacy included, a kind of, as I mentioned, adult realized sexuality, an altered one, where we can begin to bring an even better version of ourselves to our relationships and our world. Another piece of the puzzle to answering your question, why a book around sex and sexuality, is because there's a lot more to the sex paradigm than we've been sold or told, and therefore a lot more of ourselves to discover, and let our partners discover of us as well, when we allow ourselves to open up to the broader and more focused and particular landscape of the sex self-exploration. So if we are to mend this fractured humanity sexuality dyad that you and I have spoken about, the way that we split our sex selves off from ourselves, then surely I would say we need to find a new conversation. And there can be no better place for that conversation to take place than in the expansive sex and sexuality domain. And you ask a very pertinent question, Franklin, about why a book around what it means to be a heterosexual man. A brief response to that would be, because there's a whole conversation to be had around that, but as heterosexual men, I think we belong to the troublesomely named group heteronormative, which for a number of reasons seems to green card us when it comes to our needing to figure out our relationship between our personhood and our sexuality as men. So there's very little introspection there regarding who we are as sexual beings. Secondly, and importantly too, when we pair up with women, we're meeting a very different physiology, a very different emotional body, and a very different sex sensate body. And so both men and women, when connecting with each other, meet with very particular predicaments based on those differences alone. In fact, now that we're speaking about that, I want to take this opportunity to share with you that I think there's far more reverence due to afford the long and deeply connected, passionate, respectful relating between a man and a woman than we give due, because much of our folklore and cultural narrative sells us and manages to actually embed in us the illusion that this particular pairing of man and woman should always be easy and requires very little work. I don't think that's entirely true, and I think that the statistics can bear me out here. We're very much two different entities when we come together. And I think we're two different entities that do best when we actually seek to understand each other, when we listen to understand. But that's a whole nother, that's another conversation, and I think it would be interesting to have it at another time. But
I do think the conversation, and especially about the language and the differences that we see in both male and female, although being heterosexual, I do want to speak about how there are many challenges that is understood and that is shared by men, heterosexual men, and one of it is that, is the myth common, or would you say that there's at least a sense of truth to the myth in regards to male and female, where male seems to be more hungry? Because while I have a friend, and he has been married before. Recently, his engagement broke up, and he says that in most cases, it is where his partner doesn't have the sex drive as him, doesn't have the sexual liberation as him, and he never meets a partner that are really on the same level, sexual or in sexuality, as him. So is the myth true, or what is the sense of truth about men seems to be more hungrier than women when it comes to sex?
Yeah. It's a great question, Franklin. I think that there's a lot of current science out which shows, first of all, that the arousal and desire patterns of women are quite different from men. In the early studies in the 40s, 50s, and 60s in America, a lot of the research was making the man's sex cycle the gold standard, and found something to be wrong with the female arousal and desire patterns. And we now have reached another evolution of understanding that there's nothing wrong with either. They're just quite different, and it requires a little bit of awareness and awakening to meet in that place. Second to that, there are some great researchers like David Buss and Roy Baumeister. Roy Baumeister has a particular study out, I think, which collated about 150 different studies, which showed that the answer to your question is yes. Men tend towards more sexual opportunity. Men fantasize more than women. Men tend to masturbate more. Men tend to find it more difficult to say no to having sex. Men tend to prefer having more sexual partners. And there are a couple of other different indices that he points to. What I've attempted to do in the book is build on the foundation of these fantastic scientists who've given us really worthwhile quantitative statistical studies, which allow authors like myself to now say, okay, so if that's true, then what does it actually mean for you, Franklin, to live in a body that tends towards that way of being? Obviously, there are women who fall into that category too, and there are men who fall into the category of wanting sex less. There are tendencies. And I think we also need to be very careful around generalizations. One of the objectives I've attempted to follow in the book is to encourage the reader to bring the conversation down to their own experience and to and to use the different chapters in the book as a roadmap where they are able to self-reflect, do their own archaeology, and really broaden this landscape for themselves. Look, Franklin, I'm writing in the book about men that I call the men in the middle, and all of the men in the middle, or all men for that matter, experience what your friend is experiencing with his partner. But I want to draw attention to this concept of the men in the middle. Why do I use the term men in the middle? Because for the bulk of us heterosexual men, the bulk of research on heterosexual male sexuality pertains either to perpetration, sexual abuse, and so forth, or the medicalization of sex, which takes the form of medications, for example. So I don't want to diminish the criticalness of those two important conversations, but surprisingly, there's very little known about the group of heterosexual men who live way outside of these two spectrums, how we become who we are, how we make sense of being heterosexual men. In other words, to take ourselves out of the statistic and to bring ourselves into the personal conversation. That's not a field that's been very well researched at all or very well documented. So I propose that having the urgent and serious other conversations alongside this conversation is really important. And I propose that there are certainly sound and rational grounds to begin to open up a new kind of curiosity and inquiry about the heterosexual man with or without a partner who finds himself on a journey of healing and self-discovery, for him to be able to claim this conversation and to find, a sense of sexual self-agency for himself.
Yes, and I definitely do to an extent see how that can be of practice to some men, because why usually sex are being used to transgress, or sex are being used to make us feel good, and that is something that I want to extend into the part where you speak about how we never have conversations about the ones that are having a healthy sex relationship with self, healthy sexuality, or an understanding of their sexuality. And and reading the book, I discovered that it's so easy for me to read. I've discovered that I understand the language very well. Speaking the language of sex and how complex the subject can be, I know it's usually expert that speaks about those subjects, and that's why sometimes it's a bit of a mess to make sound of. But the book 6, and not even the diving into the book have really scared me. I've become more open and wanted to understand more, because why the first chapter, the second chapter, the third chapter, I can't put the book down, because why it is so easy for me, the language is so easy for me to digest, and the way the book is positioned with graphs and with cartoon images, it just plays a lovely feel to the common man actually understanding and having something to reach to. How did you, Paul, come about finding the language of such a complex subject?
That's a deep question and a beautiful question, Franklin, because many years ago I became a student of the impact of language or words on reality. And a number of philosophers have pointed to the notion that words create our reality. And I think Neil Kramer is one of the philosophers today who speaks quite cleverly when he says that we can only think with the words that we already know. Sounds obvious, but if you think about it, it's quite clever. And if I connect that to a beautiful saying that Einstein mentioned when he said that he alluded to the predicament of trying to solve a problem with the same thinking we use to create it, right? There's the word thinking again. So especially when it comes to sex and sexuality, creating new words and phrases and new words, I mean, they give us the possibility and the license to forge ahead into new paths of territories of self-discovery where we probably haven't been before. And I think in those places, all new things are possible. So each chapter, as you noticed, each chapter of the book has a table with new words and sayings for the reader to try on and see how they fit, take a drive around in the words and the sayings. And over the years, I kept an eye on what I was struggling with. Mm-hmm. And as I confirmed similar experience and struggles and things with men who were struggling with making sense of their sex lives, I found that we were all having experiences that didn't necessarily have specific words or sayings for them yet, and yet they felt very valid. So I felt called to create these new words. The term is neologism, and they seem to be able to provide an alphabet, if you like, for having a library of new understanding of yourself and your experiences, and the ability to create new experiences that were not there before. They allow a whole new way of seeing things. And on an energetic level, I like to think of it like taking a high pressure spray, water spray, or a laser against the rock face where it just feels like there's absolutely no way in. But all of a sudden, you start to create these beautiful pathways into the formation of the rock, and you go inside and you take a look around and where you couldn't go before, right? So it's a great thread that flows throughout the book, and I hope also, as it has given myself and my clients a foot up in finding new ways to discover themselves.
And speaking about opening up, I would like to just open up the book and just dive into it. I have seen how chapter 5 can really make some sense out of something that I know me as a guy, other men might be struggling with. So in many cases, when it comes to the buildup of sex, there seems to be a very active and a very involvement of us in relating to our partners. We pull up out the chair, we show up, we do this amazing activities, the chocolates and the romance comes out. And when sex happens, after sex, it just seems to be a numb. And that being the case of many guys that I spoke about, that they say the hunt is good, flowing up to the hunt, they show up, they do all these magical things. After that, there's really not any interest. And I see how chapter 5 in the book, Cognitive Reproductivism, really speaks about how we are so focused and missioned on our orgasm as men. Can you maybe speak more about chapter 5?
Absolutely, Franklin. It's one of my favorite chapters. Chapter 5 seeks to introduce the reader into the self-evaluation of our creaturehood. Cognitive reproductivism, translated, means to become aware to the degree that our bodies are biological. The kind of missioning that you're speaking about with regards to the preparation before sex, I like to term one of the predictive reproductive behaviors. There are biological and so-called natural responses that we have as men, which guide us towards being very interested in having sex. And then, as you've noticed, once ejaculation happens, the interest is not there anymore. And so from an evolutionary biological point of view, one could say that biology is really interested in having the egg meet the sperm. And once that's happened, the final whistle goes. But that's not the case, for women. Often women are interested in carrying on and maintaining the intimacy, but the caricature of us as men is that we typically fall asleep afterwards. So we've spoken a little bit about raising our awareness around our connection between our sex mind and our sex body and creating a coherence. So one of the conversations that I choose around consciousness, biology, and reproduction in this particular chapter is to highlight our tendency as men towards what I call orgasm missioning, the mission of orgasm, and how it's a hindrance that steers us away from sexual awakening, intimacy, and pushes us away from the mature masculine. In a sense, it can almost delay the becoming of our mature masculine until we develop a particular deeper understanding of what our relationship is with our orgasm. And towards the end of the book, I think in the playbook, there are a number of sex cycle maps, which you may have been alluding to, which gives the reader an opportunity to dive a little bit deeper into how the relationship with our orgasm originated at puberty, how it might have changed a little bit from puberty to adulthood, and offers steps forward as stepping stones to begin to widen our understanding of our relationship with our orgasm. But the one question that I invite in the playbook for men to become aware of is, am I aware of the relationship to my orgasm and how it impacts my life? So the decisions that I make regarding missioning towards sex, how it impacts my thoughts, my comments, all of those particular predictable reproductive behaviors that we take on as men, which have been caricatured. How do I become an observer to that and be able to notice that so that I am no longer puppeteered by the system that got set up in puberty, in essence?
And speaking about the predicament, I see in chapter 2 where you sex as a calling and the predicament of male sexuality. I see that in many cases in that chapter, it speaks about the hindrances of each predicament that is covered. I want to speak about the hindrance, or at least the understanding of men in a relationship, because what happens is that because we have in many cases, and I grew up with this romance, with the sexual sensuality of the female, with the female's body, to thinking more of the female as just a sex object, or just someone or the opposite sex that's going to please my sexuality. I think that in many cases we never give ourselves the opportunity to really understand that the opposite sex and females is more than just this body. This is a human being who has beautiful values, names, surnames, coming from a beautiful family, background, culture, and all of that. How does chapter 2, Sex and the Calling and Predicament of Our Male Sexuality, really speaks into us as men understanding more of our sexuality, our male heterosexual sexuality?
Another great question, Franklin. I want to preface that with some of the points I make in the introduction of the book. Part of what's been handed down to us is a silence around our sexuality. So that's been a lineage of thousands of years, and I refer to that as a dumbing down of our male sexuality. As well as the silence regarding any depth of information around what it means to be a heterosexual male. And I think that this hindrance has compromised our sense of well-being as men, and I think it's also affected our ability to relate deeply to women and mentor our children really well. Obviously, choosing personally to engage in this kind of work is an actionable antidote to this particular predicament. And one of the questions, and I love the way that you introduced the question, your question, but one of the questions I ask in the book is, how does my relationship with sex keep me from really seeing the person living inside the body of a woman? That sounds like an obvious thing to say. But one of the predicaments that we bump into at puberty is the objectification of the female form, the female body. It's also been shown from a research point of view that when men fantasize, we fantasize about the body parts of women generally. When women fantasize about men, they fantasize about receiving flowers, or yes, there are some women who fantasize about the body parts of men, but generally it's been shown that there's a differentiation there. So to come back to chapter 2, the predicament of male sexuality, I mean, I highlight quite a few predicaments. One of them, which I found interesting when I discovered it, was that a lot of men don't feel that they are worthy to even begin this conversation. These are the men in the middle of the bell curve, not necessarily men who perpetrate, but just straightforward guys like you and me who are looking to try and make sense of our sexuality. A lot of us don't feel that it's appropriate because our brothers in our tribes are perpetrating. And so we feel, no, we must give more voice to that and sort that out. And as well we should. I think that the conversations need to go on in parallel. And I also think that there's a usefulness to create a healthy model of heterosexual male sexuality that can serve as an option to what men are discovering around the world, and what men are finding certainly in pornography, and impacting the way that they're seeing women. So merely by looking at these predicaments and feeling that you have license to examine these predicaments for yourself, and I'm sure I've left out some predicaments as well. You'll probably come to me in a few weeks' time after you finish the book and you'll say, hey, what about this predicament? This is a big predicament for me. And I'll say, next edition, we'll put it in. But yeah, there's a magic to looking at the predicaments, because things begin to dissolve and we begin to develop a sense of spaciousness around our sexuality, because these predicaments, Franklin, that I would say that they live loud inside us, and particularly because there's no conversation about it, they make us smaller and they impact our capability for intimacy with our partners. So already by chapter 2, just starting to look at those predicaments, a spaciousness starts to happen. Some men have found that particular chapter, they've used the word redemptive. And that feels quite powerful.
And I love the word redemptive. I think that one of the clear things that I would like to mention about this conversation today is really for us as men to start really thinking about our approach to sex, and also understanding more about our sexuality. So in many cases, it is a scary factor to start talking about sex. Yeah. It's a huge subject.
It's very courageous. For us, I have to jump in here, Franklin. It's very courageous, because in actual fact, I feel like we're at a kind of a Goldilocks zone of opportunity here. There's so much willingness to grasp what it means to be more awake, more aware, and more conscious amongst both men and women, that we have an opportunity in our generation now to break thousands of years of silence around what it means to build a healthy relationship and to model and discover healthy male heterosexual sexuality. So it's courageous and it's brave, because it's breaking a very, very long cycle.
Yeah.
Apologies for interrupting.
Not all good, because why that leads up to my next question. Because why, what are the challenges that lie ahead for men wanting to awaken to a wider landscape of themselves with sex, intimacy, and conscious relationship? If we are looking to repair any fractured relationship we have with sex, and how your book, how do you identify the hindrance and predicaments we face once we started to open ourselves up to an actionable and to practical and to really being conscious heterosexual men? How do we as men then really show up in the world saying, let's have this conversation?
Yeah. That's a very big question. And I'm going to try to answer it in a way that it deserves an answer. I think the first piece is that we all need to think again about what we think we already know about sex, relationship, and our sex mind and our sex body. So that's the first step. We need to give ourselves permission to think again about what we think we know. And a significant piece of the puzzle regarding your question, regarding how we modern heterosexual men can find a way through towards a more adult realized sexuality into deeper awareness and presence around sex and relating, is by expanding our awareness of who we are as sexual beings, period. Now, one of the predicaments with that is that there's not a lot of conversation around it. There's not a lot of places to find it, but it's useful for men to find men like yourself, to sit in circle and to have those conversations, to use a book similar to mine, or use my book, which has got hundreds of questions and sparks a lot of new conversation and reflection. And that's where the dialogue really needs to begin. Obviously, some of this work can be done by talking about it, but a lot of the work is about actioning into the new landscape of what it feels like. And it's useful if your partner, if the woman in your life is supportive, and it's even more useful if she's on her own journey of self-discovery, because women have their own awakening, and it looks slightly different to our awakening. But it's a wonderful thing when partners are doing that awakening journey together, as a team, separately, but as a team. And then what begins to happen in the relationship is that the energy of the relationship begins to spiral to places that are truly extraordinary, truly outside of the mundane. And there is no ceiling to that experience. It just keeps on growing and keeps on developing. And it's a very beautiful thing, and it's a very privileged place to live out life.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to ask that. Is your book pretty well set up for practical methods and ways of really tackling the issue of sex and sexuality?
So the short answer to that question is yes, it is. I mean, the map itself is a stepping stone guide where men can take the journey in a very metered way according to their own desire. They can make very, very small micro adjustments or macro adjustments as they desire and as they require. There are emblems throughout the book which show, hey, you're coming up to a place where there's self-reflection. Maybe take a journal and start writing some notes, or just go away, put the book down and go away and think about it. And then there is a very dedicated practical workbook in chapter 8. It's called the playbook. And the playbook is designed to bring you in the third part of the playbook to practices with your partner.
Ah, that is pretty good. Now, on the vast knowledge and youth discovery on the journey of sex and sexuality, what would, and really to men that are having challenges, to men who are busy awakening up to this, to sex and their sexuality, what would Paul's message be for the viewer who are right now watching and looking at a book called Sex and are so ready to dive into this? What would be Paul's message for them?
Well, first of all, lots of respect for picking the book up, lots of respect for the courage. But my encouragement would be to say, grab the opportunity and take the first step, begin the journey, break the chain, break the silence of thousands of years. And certainly if you have kids and you're fathering kids, you will be able to give your kids something that most men on the planet didn't have the benefit of getting. And if you have a partner, you will certainly be able to bring the best version of yourself to your partner and continue to create space for your relationship to grow and develop. And by the way, it's a wonderful environment for kids to experience, because kids really, really pick up on the energetic that goes on between their parents.
Ah, thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate you for sharing your voice, not just to Conversations and Translation, but also to us as men and to the world out there, that we can really make straight of those questions that sometimes lead us so astray. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Franklin. It's been a delight, and I look forward to many more conversations. Thank you.
Definitely. What I will be taking out today out of our conversation is that we as men, we need to start think more broader about sex and our sexuality, not just only to the factors that are challenging, also to getting an education where we can also explore more on this avenue. Start to have open conversations around the topic of sex and sexuality. Be courageous, and also pick up the book called Sex. Thank you so much for joining us today. We want to say that today we are going to give one lucky listener with Paul's booklet called Sex. So stay tuned and read the caption once you are finished listening to the show. This is Conversations and Translations, and you are listening to me, Franklin Esau. Conversations and Translations is where the conversation is real and the dive is deep. See you again next time. There's so many things I can take away from the book. I think that one of the most amazing things I can take away from the book, for the first time, sex, the topic of sex is, it doesn't feel judgmental. It doesn't feel like it's slamming those different opinions against the wall. Even when you mention something like the Western culture, their understanding of sexuality, it doesn't come across as harsh. Even the diverse and complex concepts that you speak about in the book, it doesn't come across as a bit of rough edge, or it doesn't come across as something that is hard to swallow or even difficult. It doesn't come across noisy. you know. So that is one of the things that I definitely appreciate about this. I am going to have the best thing that is happening to me while reading this book is that really I'm opening up. I'm having a different understanding towards sex and sexuality, because what I had, to a sense, you have an idea there's a difference between sex and sexuality, but usually one depends on the other one and the other one depends on the other one. But I've seen how different and how far apart one from each other can really live within us as heterosexual males. I'm opening up, I'm seeing more, I'm realizing more about myself. And I'm looking forward to continuing in the book and really, because this is the first book that I've actually I'm reading a chapter and then I go back. And then I go back with my highlight and I'm reading, and then I go back with my pen. Oh, there's some more things that needs to be highlighted. So I go back and forth. This is like, and I'm not obligated. I'm not studying anything. I'm not researching anything. I'm not obligated to read it in research mode. But I'm definitely feeling that I need to take as much in of this book that I can. So